Hi, everybody. Welcome to this mini lecture from Chapter 2 material. The topic I'm going to cover here is hydrogen bonds and water. So before you watch this video, though, I want to make sure that you have gone through and watched some of the other ones that I have posted from YouTube or read through the text and the notes, the PowerPoint in reference to atomic structure, periodic table, valence electrons, chemical bonds like covalent bonds, ionic bonds. So that information you should have kind of under your belt before we jump into this topic. So if you haven't done that yet, go back and watch some of those videos, go through the PowerPoint or the section in the textbook that talks about those. Because if you don't have a good grasp on that, what I'm going to talk about here may not make sense. So let's get started. All right, so when we start talking about hydrogen bonds, before we can get to actually what is a hydrogen bond, we have to discuss electronegativity. So you've already gone through the videos on covalent bonds and ionic bonds from the other YouTube resources. So if you remember, covalent bonds are where two atoms share their valence electrons to fulfill their octet, right? So we want 8 electrons in our valence shell. And if 2 or more atoms can do that by sharing the charge of the electron, then that's what's called a covalent bond. Now, when we talk about electronegativity, we're talking about the attractiveness or the strength that an atom's nucleus has for attracting electrons. And the higher that you are in electronegativity, the stronger that attraction for electrons. So for example, if we look at this corner of the periodic table right here, we can see that those are pretty high electronegativity. They're on this kind of this orange and red range of this scale. But atoms like carbon and hydrogen are really kind of lower, right? They're kind of in the middle range. So when we look at things, chemicals that are bonded that have different electronegativities, what that's going to give us is an unequal sharing of those electrons. So we're going to take a look at how water is formed. So water is one oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms. And so we can see that here, hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. And if we remember our octet rule, or for the hydrogen, they want 2. So oxygen, if we count their electrons, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 electrons in its valence shell. So it needs 2 more electrons to fulfill its octet. Hydrogen, each hydrogen only has 1 electron in its valence shell. And it needs 1 more to fulfill its, I call it a duplet, even though I don't think that's an actual term. So the way that oxygen and hydrogen can fulfill that requirement is by sharing electrons. So if we look over here at the water molecule, we can see that this hydrogen has 2 electrons in its valence shell, now that it's sharing 1 with oxygen. This hydrogen has 2 electrons in its valence shell, right? And then if we look at the whole molecule of oxygen, it has 8 electrons in its valence shell. So each one of those atoms have fulfilled their valence shell requirements. But because we are bonding an oxygen with a high electronegativity with a hydrogen that has a lower electronegativity, what we end up with is an unequal sharing of those electrons. So if you'll notice, most of the hydrogen's electrons are hanging out closest to the nucleus of the oxygen, leaving that little old nucleus of the hydrogen atom kind of hanging out all by itself without a lot of electrons swirling around it. So these hydrogen atoms on that side of the molecule tend to have a more partially positive charge. So my head is kind of blocking that, so I'll put partial positive. And then the oxygen side of the molecule is partially negative. So when you have a polar bond, so this would be a polar covalent bond, they're sharing, but they're sharing unequally, this is how you can set up hydrogen bonds. And so we're going to take a look at hydrogen bonds next. But before we can do hydrogen bonds, I wanted to make sure you had an understanding of polar covalent bonds. And it's all due to this unequal sharing of electrons between different electronegative atoms. Okay, so here is our hydrogen bonds. So let's say we have a water molecule over here. So this is H2O. And we have an ammonium ion over here, or NH3. ammonia. This will be a 3. So when we have oxygen bound to hydrogen, oxygen was one of those higher electronegative atoms, and hydrogen was one of the medium. So there's a difference. So our oxygen side of the atom is going to be, oops, that is not right. Oxygen atom is going to have the negative charge, while the hydrogen is going to have this positive charge. And then same with the nitrogen. So these are polar covalent bonds. So nitrogen is going to be negative, and all of these hydrogen atoms are going to carry a positive charge. So overall, the NH3, the N is more negatively charged, the hydrogen is more positively charged. On the water, the oxygen is more negatively charged, the hydrogen is more positively charged. So when you get two molecules that have this polarness to them, and you get the opposite charges of these partial positive and partial negatives, this is what makes the hydrogen bond. So the partial positive of the water molecule is being attracted to the partial negative of the ammonia molecule. And so usually hydrogen bonds are shown by little dashes or dots, kind of like what we see here. Okay? So this is a hydrogen bond. It's not a very strong bond. You can see it's under the category of weak bonds. There's no full-on sharing of electrons. It's not like an ionic bond. It's not like a covalent bond. It's just more of an attraction of the partial positive of one to the partial negative of the other. Okay, so that's basically our definition of a hydrogen bond. Now we're going to take a look at how that works in water and why that gives water such amazing, unique characteristics. So here I just drew or have these diagrams of a whole bunch of different water molecules. They're showing the same thing. So we have the oxygen is the red atom and hydrogen is the white atom. So every time you see the white, these guys are going to have the positive charge, because they were the lower electronegative. Anytime you see the red side of this molecule, those are going to be the negatives, right? And so everything's labeled over here on this other picture. So whenever you get a couple water molecules close together, you're going to have the attraction between the negative and the positive. So there's one hydrogen bond, there's a hydrogen bond, and again, you remember they're shown by these little dotted dots or dashed lines. So those are 4 hydrogen bonds between these 5 water molecules. They still have covalent bonds, right? So these solid line bonds we see here and right here, those are covalent bonds that are polar covalent and unequal sharing, resulting in the partial positive and partial negative. Again, here's a hydrogen bond in this picture, 2, 3, 4. So those are dashed lines. And so these hydrogen bonds, again, are just the attractions between the partial positive and partial negative charges of these polar molecules, the water molecules. And since water is so watery, pure water, is just a whole bunch of these polar molecules, you're going to have a whole bunch of these positive and negative charges hanging out next to each other, and it gives water very unique characteristics. So one of the things that water can do because of this polarity is it makes a great solvent. So a solvent is something that dissolves. So the solute is the substance that's being dissolved. A solvent is the thing that's doing the dissolving. So let's say you're making salt water, right? Or you're going to boil some pasta and you put some salt in your pot of water. Water, right? So all the little Mickey Mouses, I'm going to use a different color because red kind of blends in. So, right, so all of our oxygens are going to have the positive, see, I'm doing it wrong. All of our oxygens are going to have the negatives, and all of the hydrogens are going to have positives. So when in an ionic compound like sodium chloride, because of the ionic bonds, water can get in and actually break pieces of an ionic compound apart, where the negative charge chlorine is being surrounded by the positive charges on the water, and the positive charge sodium is being surrounded by the negative charges on the water. And so it rips and breaks apart those ionic bonds and releasing the sodium ion and the chlorine ion, and that's what we call dissolving. So the salt is dissolving in water because of the polarity of the water. So I have a little joke over here. It says, I just love hanging out with you, chloride. Hee hee, sodium. Oh no, is that water? What? Where? I'll never forget you. Right? Because water's pulling apart the sodium, right? Cute. So water is a great solvent because of that polar nature. So anything that dissolves in water, think of making a sugar water, salt water, anything that dissolves in water, if it can dissolve in water, it's a really good clue that that substance has some polarness to it, because water will be attracted to other things that have charges because it itself has charges. Okay. Some other characteristics of water is what we call cohesion, adhesion, and surface tension. So cohesion is the idea of two water molecules sticking to each other, just like in the previous slide, via hydrogen bonds. So here we have an example of cohesion, right here in the middle. So cohesion, we have two water molecules hooked together via hydrogen bonds, the partial positive and the partial negative attracted to each other. Adhesion, right here, is the hydrogen bonding their attraction of a water molecule to something else. So in this case, the water molecules are attracted to the cell wall of this particular plant tube. Okay? So here's the idea of this picture, of why I've used this picture. So in your tree root system, the cells inside of the root are hypertonic. We learned that word with the gummy bear lab last week. So hypertonic is when you have more solutes. Things are more salty or more sugary, and water tends to go towards those more concentrated areas. So water is going to move from the soil into the roots, right? So now they're in the roots. I'm going to jump ahead up here to the leaves, kind of up in this area. The air has less water in it than the leaves do. And so water wants to go from a high water concentration inside the leaves to a lower water concentration in the atmosphere, and this is called transpiration. So it's almost like a pump, a pumpless pump, if you will. So as water is being transpired out of the leaves, escaping into the atmosphere, that's helping to draw the water and the hypertonicity of the roots from the soil into the root system. So how do we get from the roots 200 feet high to the leaves? Well, we have all of these tubes, all of the tubes that are running up the tree. They're called xylem. And they have made up of kind of hollow cells. They're almost like straws, if you will. But the cell wall, the side of that tube is polar. It's got a charge to it. So water is going to be attracted to it. And then since water is polar and water is polar, the water is going to be attracted to itself. So as the transpiration happens at the top, it's almost like pulling each individual water molecule up these tubes, allowing the water to be drawn up from the soil through the xylem up to the leaves, allows for photosynthesis to happen. Some of those water molecules escape and transpiration, and it's thanks to adhesion and cohesion that allows for this process to happen. So cohesion, two water molecules hooking to themselves. Adhesion is a water molecule hooking to something else that's polar. Okay, so that's the definition of those two terms. Surface tension, like we see here with the paper clip sitting on top of the water glass, or think of one of those little water strider bugs that go on the surface. Surface tension is basically just water, pure water at the top of between the water-air boundary. All of those hydrogen bonds are holding on to that, holding on to each other, and they can actually withstand weight and volume of certain things. I'm going to post a video on Blackboard. It'll be the International Space Station washcloth example. Is a really good video for you to witness surface tension and adhesion and cohesion in a gravity-less space, so a zero gravity environment of the International Space Station. The astronaut does a really wonderful demonstration with water, illustrating the hydrogen bonds, the surface tension, adhesion, and cohesion. So make sure you watch that video linked there in the Blackboard. So those are some characteristics of water that's unique to water because of its polar properties and the ability for it to produce hydrogen bonds with itself. Okay. Some other terms that we might be associating with water is hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So the root hydro means water, right? And philic means to love, and phobic means fearing or to hate. So there are some molecules that are hydrophilic and that they love being close to water, and there are some molecules that are hydrophobic that, yeah, get me away from you. Some of these you probably are already familiar with, and we've identified a few in the previous slide. So hydrophilic molecules are ones that are going to have a polar charge. So like salts and sugar and the xylem plasma cell walls. Those are hydrophilic. They are charged. Water can attach to them. There's something for them to do with that other molecule. A hydrophobic something is going to be a molecule that doesn't have any polar charges to it. So here I have an example of a molecule that actually has both of these properties. It's called a phospholipid. We're going to be seeing it a lot more in chapter 4 and 5. But if you look at this top part in this gray box, they're calling it the hydrophilic head. So hydrophilic means water loving, and we can tell that it's water loving because first of all, we can actually see some ions here in this nitrogen and the oxygen, but we can also see that there's going to be some polar covalent bonds because we have bonds between oxygen and carbon and between hydrogen and oxygen. All right, so we know that this is polar, so this is okay to be around water. But if we take a look at the tail part, they're calling this hydrophobic, is because there are no polar characteristics. It's a fat, it's called a fatty acid. You're gonna be learning about that in chapter 3. So when you have a big long carbon chain and you have carbon bonded to a whole bunch of carbon, and then it's bonded to a whole bunch of hydrogens, if we go back to that electronegative periodic table, I can't in the video, but you can stop and go back if you wanted to. Hydrogen and carbon had the same electronegativities. So if you have a whole bunch of carbons and hydrogens, there's no unequal sharing. Everybody's sharing the electrons equally. There's no charges. So if water wants to come along with its negative oxygen and positive hydrogens, they will be a repelling, don't come near me. There's nothing for you to be attracted to. So hydrophobic molecules are ones that repel water. So I have a picture of oil being dropped into a glass of water, and you should be familiar just living life and having experiences that oil and water don't mix, right? And the reason is because oil is hydrophobic and water is polar. Since hydrophobic molecules are nonpolar, you can't mix polar and nonpolar. They just don't have that characteristic. And like I said, again, we're going to see this in chapter 4 and chapter 5 when we start looking at lipids and the structure of the plasma membrane, because these phospholipids are going to be part of that structure of your cell's plasma membrane. All right, some other characteristics because of this hydrogen bond, some characteristics of water that make it unique is its unique thermal properties. So you might, again, just because of life experiences, know that solid water, which is what we call ice, is less dense than liquid water, which we usually just call water. And gaseous water or water vapor is the least dense of all those three. So here we can see an iceberg, we can see a waterfall, and we can see some steam, some water vapor. Now, in other similarly sized molecules, the solid state of that other molecule is going to be more dense, because when you have a solid, the molecules are so close together, it becomes that state of matter of being a solid. When they warm up and move around a little bit, they get further apart from each other and less dense, and that's the liquid form. And when they move even further apart and become the gaseous form, that's the least dense. But water is unique because these two are actually flip-flopped in their density. Ice or solid water is less dense, and the reason why is because of those hydrogen bonds. So when you have solid water, you can see in this diagram, everything is all like, I'll do green, evenly spaced. So there is nice open spaces between each of the water molecules. They're kind of like arm's length apart from each other. Don't get closer to me. And this is what happens when the temperature decreases, they kind of get into this rigid form. When ice melts and becomes water, they can actually get a little bit closer together. And so now you have less space in between each water molecule, and they can be closer together. And so that's going to make them more dense. So that's why you can have solid water, ice, floating on top of liquid water. Solid water is less dense than liquid water, which is way not the norm for stuff. We take it for granted because we're familiar with ice cubes floating in our cup of ice water, but that is not a normal characteristic for molecules of similar sizes because of those hydrogen bonds. All right, so here we can see, again, this rigid structure because of the hydrogen bonds keeps everything kind of far apart from each other, where in liquid water, the hydrogen bonds allow them to be a lot closer. So there's your ice cubes and there's your iceberg. Even huge multi-ton pieces of solid water can float in liquid water. Okay. Another unique characteristic of water due to the hydrogen bonds is what's called the high heat of vaporization. This is basically how much heat you have to put into water before it becomes steam, going from a transition from a liquid phase to a gaseous phase. And again, comparing this to other similarly sized molecules, water is super unique. We have to go from 80 calories per gram of energy, calories per gram is a unit of energy, all the way up to 540 calories. We have to input all of that energy before we can go from a liquid water to a gaseous water, right? So liquid water at 0 degrees to boiling water at 100 degrees. It takes that much heat, that much energy to go into the system before we can convert from a liquid water to a gaseous water. And the reason why, what's the answer of the day? Hydrogen bonds. All of those hydrogen bonds holding the molecules so close together takes a lot of input to break them apart and rip the liquid water into the gaseous water vapor that's now spread really far apart. So when you put on a pot of water to boil, it takes a while. It takes a lot of energy to go into that pot of boiling water before you actually start getting the boiling and the steam produced. Compare that to like ethanol, which is it's a little bit bigger molecule, but it's moderately comparable in size. Alcohol, ethanol, like an alcohol swab. You put some alcohol, or the hand sanitizers like 60, 70% alcohol. You put that down just on the heat of your hand and it evaporates within minutes. You don't have to put in a lot of heat for that to go from the liquid phase to the gaseous phase. Whereas a equal sized puddle of water is going to take a lot longer to go from a liquid phase to gaseous phase. And that's because of the hydrogen bonds, this high heat of vaporization, which is good for biological systems because it allows them to have a broad range of temperatures without going from a liquid to a gaseous phase in a short period of time. It gives living things a bigger range to have life in, right? Okay. So here's some of the comparisons of these similarly sized substances or similar substances. So water has a specific heat, this unit, calories per gram per centimeter per Celsius. Water has a unit of 1. So that alcohol is about almost half that. So it takes almost half the amount of energy to convert alcohol from the liquid form to the gaseous form, where it takes a whole unit of energy to turn liquid water to gaseous water. Okay, and so related to specific heat is this idea of heat capacity. So the example that I'm going to give for this one is climate or weather capabilities of how water, big, large bodies of water can impact the temperature. So here we have a map of the Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, San Diego, kind of that part of Southern California. And if we go inland, we can see Santa Ana, Palm Springs, Riverside, San Bernardino, and kind of the temperature variation. So when you're in the 70s at the coast, you might be in the hundreds and over hundreds out further away in the desert area. So the reason why we have such a big difference in temperatures is because this huge body of water, the Pacific Ocean, can hold and absorb a lot of heat during the day and not change its temperature a great deal because of all of that, right? All of the heat of vaporization. It takes a lot of energy before it goes from a liquid water to a gaseous water. So when you live close to large bodies of water, during the day, the water absorbs a lot of the heat. And then at night, it releases the heat. When the sun goes down, it's not absorbing the heat, but it'll then release that heat back into the atmosphere. So during the day, the ocean takes up a lot of the sun's energy, and at night, it releases that back into the atmosphere. And that keeps these coastal cities a lot more buffered in their temperatures. So they might have a day-night temperature range like this, whereas when you get further inland, like Palm Springs, they don't have that buffering. They're just surrounded by sand and granite and dirt and stuff, which has very low heat capacity. So they heat up really hot in the day and reflect that heat back into the atmosphere. And so you get really, really hot. So you have 106 there in Palm Springs. And then when the sun goes down, they release that heat very, very quickly. And so you actually have really low nighttime temperatures. So your daily fluctuations of temperature might be really big, maybe 40 degrees at night and 100 degrees during the heat of the day. That's a 60-degree difference. Or maybe at Los Angeles, by the coast, you might get 60 degrees at night and 75 degrees during the day. So that's only a 15-degree difference. And that's because of this large body of water that they're next to helps to kind of buffer a lot of the heat during the day and release a lot of that heat at night where you don't have that inland. And so that's why if you've ever traveled or lived in the Midwest or away from coastlines, you know those temperature extremes can be very large. Where if you live or visit the coastlines, you can see those temperature extremes are not quite as large. All right, so that's our little bit longer of a mini lesson today covering electronegativity, a little bit on polar covalent bonds and their role of making hydrogen bonds and the unique properties of water thanks to those hydrogen bonds. All right, so that's it for this lecture. I will see you next time.